just another story of the same.
You know, we're having a good time.
Just be respectful, dudes, and never learn.
So this is the Baltimore Bureau podcast and the Baltimore Bureau podcast show. You're noticing my voice first this week because co-host Darna Noor is in New Orleans, where Eddie Conway, executive producer here, real spectacular person, hard to say enough about Eddie, is getting married this weekend. So
Yeah. Congratulations, Eddie.
yeah, way to go, Eddie.
Yeah, man.
And so with me today, you just heard him, just another story as we were leading into this, going with his band Soul Cannon. We have Easy Jackson.
Yeah. What's up, man?
Not much. So we're here a week ago. Yesterday was, last week we were talking about Freddie Gray's arrest and being put into a coma in the back of the police van. And yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of his death.
Yeah.
And so right now we're in the midst of the anniversary of the uprising that followed that. And it's hard to believe that that was 3 years ago.
Yeah, and I think we talked a little bit about this on your Democracy in Crisis podcast. I think it's important that we continue to revisit Freddie Gray and what happened. 3 years, and if you've been in Baltimore, you've seen the fanfare die out, and this is the year where I feel like it's 3 years since Freddie Gray's happened, and almost nobody's talking about it.
Yeah.
But if you look at it, if we continue to look at it, we can assess where we've been, where we're going, what's changed, what's not changed. And a lot of things still have not changed since April of 2015.
Yeah, so many of the conditions haven't changed, and yet so much of what we thought we understood about it has changed. Like, the residents looted all the pharmacies and they sold those drugs, and that created all of the murders. And then we found out during the Gun Trace Task Force trial that it was police who were stealing and selling at least $1 million worth of those drugs. And so, we want to take a look back today at one of the Freddie Gray stories that we did back in 2015. You weren't here back then, were you?
I wasn't at the Real News then, no.
Yeah, I wasn't either, so not that we did, either one of us. But this is Stephen Janis and then Eddie Conway. You'll see Eddie talking to a lot of residents at Gilmore about what life was like there. And for City Paper at the time, I did some similar reporting, talking to people. And as a white dude, I got to say, I was sort of shocked. It was really an awakening moment to talk to so many people, young women, and the older woman that we were looking at the picture of today who's holding up her finger, like she couldn't walk to the store without getting stopped and sat down and searched every time. And to me, that was really a eye-opening thing to see. And so let's go and kick back and listen to what some of these folks have to say.
It's a growing memorial constructed from the remnants of a man's life and death. A man who has come to symbolize one neighborhood's pain and a city's frustration. Residents of Gilmore Homes trying to make something meaningful out of the brief life of Freddie Gray and his death while in police custody. This is where Gray was initially detained and where he started what would be a slow and painful procession towards death in the back of a police paddy wagon. And while police continue to stonewall on the details surrounding just exactly how Gray's neck was severed from his spine, his community has begun the process of bearing witness to the cross-currents of heavy-handed policing and neglect from City Hall they believe are at the root of his death that has rocked not just the community, but transfixed the nation.
And it's not okay for you to beat our young men like they slaves, you slaughtering them. It's not okay to do that.
Gray died a week after he was arrested. Police say they have no evidence of use of force. 6 officers have been suspended, and the Justice Department has joined the investigation. But witnesses from his community say police are not telling the truth.
The paddy wagon was right there. They took the young man out, beat him some more.
Real News Network correspondent Eddie Conway spoke to the people who were there. One woman described how she saw firsthand what she believes were actions by police that contributed to Gray's death.
The man wasn't responding. They took him by his pants, and he was dragging. And I asked them to call the ambulance. They told me to mind my business. I told them it is my business.
Another, a blind resident, said he heard Gray pleading for help, which never came.
Now they must have thrown him down. He was hollering, "Come on, you hurting my back. Get your knee out my back. You hurting my neck."
The Gilmore Homes project, where Gray grew up in West Baltimore, bears the scars of neglect. A dilapidated basketball court has sat broken for years. The housing which surrounds it falling into disrepair. But the decay of the physical infrastructure has not stopped the city from flooding the neighborhood with police. A constant flow of law enforcement that residents told Conway made it impossible to even stand outside in a place where they grew up.
They ride past and we right here, they'll make us move. And even if we live right here or not, go inside the court, you can't stand here.
They won't let us sit nowhere. They'll tell us move, we gotta go here, we gotta move off there. We're not doing nothing.
In fact, Gilmore Homes is one of the most heavily policed and incarcerated neighborhoods in the city. The Justice Policy Institute estimates the state spends $17 million annually just to lock up residents of the West Baltimore community, which is why residents say the cycle of neglect and punishment only makes things worse.
They had beat my friend up real bad, and they handcuffed me just because I was saying, why y'all beating him like that? Why y'all beating him like that? They put handcuffs on me.
What the fuck y'all expect us to go do when we come home? Yeah. We on parole and all that shit. We gonna go there and get to jail. They checking 10 years back, 11 years back, and all that dumb shit. Y'all expect niggas to get a job.
And why the death of Freddie Gray is symbolic in a city where policing and poverty seem inextricably linked. Reporting for the Real News Network, Stephen Janis in Baltimore.
All right, so that was Eddie Conway and Stephen Janis with I got to say, Stephen, I'm glad you got your hair cut. Looking good these days. And we're going to come back to some more Freddie Gray. We're going to end with another piece that Jessel Noor did on Freddie Gray at the end. But, you know, there's actually a ton. This is just sort of the Taya Graham and Stephen Janis hour on the show this week. They did a ton of reporting this weekend. They've been working on this one for a while. It's a story about another TIF, another big tax break, going to Beatty, who did Harbor Point right around the corner. And we see City Council Pres Jack Young actually saying, you know, hell no on this, which is sort of a refreshing thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's refreshing to see Jack Young, a Baltimore City elected official, pushing back, because for so long this has been very much supported by Baltimore elected officials, tax breaks to developers, development in certain areas without investment in low-income areas, crime-ridden areas. So I think this is a good piece to watch and keep paying attention to.
All right, let's check it out.
This is Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. Tax breaks for developers have been a big issue in Baltimore, and some thought that story was over, but it turns out it's just beginning. To get a sense of just how expansive Baltimore's latest tax break finance development deal is, you have to drive. The project will encompass huge swaths of the city's low-income neighborhoods, including a former outdoor mall called Old Town and a low-income housing project, Perkins Homes. The city says the deal will span over 200 acres and includes rebuilding a school and a recreation center. But like many of the most recent deals to redevelop the city, who benefits and who doesn't paints a picture of just how Baltimore works for some and not for others. That's because Perkins and Old Town has suffered from decades of neglect and little direct investment, and its residents are mired in poverty.
You know, this is around about the third time they said they was gonna tear the property down and then leave us hanging. You know, and these places are so bad. You know, the rodents, the bed bugs, the smells, the pipes, everything is wrong with these places.
But even with this fraught history of neglect, the city has floated a plan to give a generous tax incentive to developers who have proposed this massive redevelopment. The city is considering offering a possible $250 million TIF, or tax increment finance incentive, to a group of wealthy out-of-town developers, says Baltimore Business Journal reporter Melody Simmons.
So my sources are telling me the TIF is somewhere around $250 million, even though the price tag has not been identified yet.
A TIF allows the developer to plow all future property taxes back into the project through city-backed bonds. It's a boom for developers that city officials often justify by arguing the TIF pays for infrastructure or amenities.
And they're also going to be adding a lot of infrastructure and cables for high tech, which that area doesn't have right now.
And for this particular TIF, it is linked to a developer who has a fraught history of taking advantage of city largesse, Beatty Development. In 2013, Beatty used Perkins Homes to sweeten his deal for this project, Harbor Point. He included the household incomes of Perkins to qualify for an additional $80 million in enterprise zone tax credits, even though Perkins residents received nothing.
That they're going to move all of us back in here and it's going to be a better place and all that, because half of the people not going to be able to come back at all.
Which is why City Council President Jack Young says he is opposed to the TIF for the Perkins Old Town project.
At first it's just supposed to be an Old Town. Then they're adding Perkins because they're going after a choice neighborhood grant.
He says he wants assurances residents of Perkins can come back once it's completed.
If they're not going to bring these people back, then I don't have an appetite for a TIF. I have to have a guarantee that these folk who live there can come back. Because what I don't want to see is that neighborhood gentrified.
And it could be quite a big, some people saying $250 million. To TIF for developers?
I don't have no appetite for no $250 million TIF at all.
Why not?
Because it's just too large of a TIF.
A concern echoed by Councilman Robert Stokes, whose district includes a vast majority of the project.
TIF should be based on we can get as many people back there because they stayed there when it was riddled with crime, no recreation, no after-school programs. They should have the same opportunity to come back and enjoy what's going to change in that neighborhood.
We asked Beatty for comment, but he did not reply. But perhaps an indication of just how lucrative Baltimore's tax break haven has become is the looming presence of investment bank Goldman Sachs. Goldman is one of the largest investment banks in the world and has been accused of predatory practices. And yet Goldman has invested $233 million in the city's largest tax break to date, Port Covington, a veritable city on the water owned by Under Armour CEO and billionaire Kevin Plank. But the real news has learned that Goldman is an investor in this, a 200-apartment complex on the city's west side, a project that also benefits from a tax break called a pilot, which allows a developer to forego paying property taxes for years. We asked the mayor about the latest series of deals.
There was an article about the proposed TIF, possible TIF for Perkins Homes redevelopment and the Old Town Mall. Have you taken a position on that? Do you support a tax break for developers to redevelop that?
Well, I am actually meeting with the team that's working on the Perkins Home project, and I can give you more information after that. But let me just say, as we give tax incentive financing to areas in our downtown part of our city, I think it's important as we're developing neighborhoods and communities that we look at the kind of opportunities and tax breaks that we'll give for that kind of development as well.
Do you feel like the residents of Perkins Home are going to benefit? I mean, it's basically going to developers, not to the residents. I mean,
well, again, I haven't had a conversation with them yet, and we haven't determined how a TIF would be used, if in fact it will be used at all.
So at this point, you're not sure if you support a TIF yet, you haven't made up your mind, or are you still considering? Just so I understand.
Well, again, I'm meeting with the group. I think it's this week, it's on my schedule, and I'll be able to give you better information. I don't like to give misinformation. Okay.
And the involvement of Goldman Sachs.
No, they were in just last week, didn't say anything about the bonds, did talk about, they came in with Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is investing, as you well know, is one of the investors in Port Covington. They're also one of the investors in La Cité. I've also asked them, Goldman Sachs, to take a look at what we're doing at Mondawmin. I asked them to look at the possibility of a movie theater in Mondawmin, so that they are taking a look at that.
So Goldman Sachs might invest in Mondawmin?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Former Councilman Carl Stokes says businesses like Goldman are lured to Baltimore because the deals are too enticing to pass up. Money, he said, should go to helping residents, not wealthy out-of-town developers.
The developers are asking, as they should. It's self-interest. It's the city who reneges on the taxpayers. It's the city who says, take all the money you want. Here's some more money. It's the city who does that. I know in more than one deal that has come across my desk that the developer, as best I could tell, put up a number that he assumed there would be a negotiation around. He put up a high number and assumed the city would start fighting with them to get down to a lower number. I say this because more than once a developer has called me a year in advance, 2 years in advance, and said, I need X number of dollars. You think they may work with me? And I said, of course, call them. Let's see what happens. And when it gets to me, the number is 2.5 times larger than it was. And I said, what the hell's going on? At least one time a developer was frank enough to share with me and said, the city said, you can ask for more. You can ask for more. right? And they accepted that number.
But with the latest proposal to rebuild the Old Town and Perkins Home communities, it seems the deals just keep getting better. This is Stephen Janis and Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore, Maryland.
All right, so I've been, if you've been watching this or listening to this podcast or podcast video TV program, you've been seeing that I've been talking to all of the candidates in the state's attorney's race. This is the final part of my conversation with Marilyn Mosby. And, you know, she talks about Tyrone West. She talks about Keith Davis Jr. in here. But after this conversation, this was before her campaign headquarters opened. Her headquarters opened on, what day was that, Saturday?
Yeah.
Yeah, on Saturday. And so I wrote a piece about that, and I was trying to get some feedback in the office and read a little bit of it to you, and you suggested that I read it out loud.
Yeah, because I think it's great. You should go ahead and do that.
All right, so this is, you can find this story on The Real News. Now I just lost it on, I was going to read it here on my phone, and too many tabs open. Here we go. Nope, damn it. Talk for a second, Easy, while I find this thing.
Now, I think this piece that you're getting ready to show, that we're getting ready to put on, about her talking about Tyrone West and Keith Davis is great. When we talk about, I was talking about earlier, constantly revisiting the Freddie Gray incident. Tyrone West is murdered by police officers before Freddie Gray, and then Keith Davis is the first person shot by police officers post Freddie Gray. And I think you gave Marilyn Mosby a chance to kind of talk about, from her point, the big picture, you know, and see why she has critics, you know, and just giving a little deeper look into the state's attorney's race and what it means for Black Baltimore.
Yeah, and so the two main critics in this piece I'm about to read a bit from were Kelly Halsey Davis, who is the wife now of Keith Davis, and Kenji Scott, who worked for her at one time, and are both Black. One of the things she says is that much of the criticism against her is either racist or sexist or ageist, because she's young. She's younger than I think both of us, younger than me at least. And so this you can find it on therealnews.com. We'll have a Monday, a new site where it will be even more friendly to your eyes for reading. State's Attorney of Baltimore, Marilyn Mosby, stepped out of the celebratory atmosphere of her new campaign headquarters on Cathedral Street into a carnival-esque scene of anti-Mosby sentiment playing out on the sidewalk and parking lot out front. Inside, she had been cheered by supporters, among whom were City Council President Bernard Jack Young and Council members Christopher Burnett, Mary Pat Clark, who snuck out early, and Robert Stokes, who helped rehang some of the signs falling from the walls. Beside her, on the steps, which were serving as a stage, stood her husband, Delegate Nick Mosby. She was endorsed by the AFL-CIO, and her speech was met with rapturous applause of roughly 75 people crammed into the small office, most of them wearing red Re-elect Marilyn Mosby shirts. But outside, she is greeted by the chant, "Free Keith Davis! Drop the charges!" a reference to a case Mosby has continued to pursue against a man shot 3 times by police in 2015. The small but passionate crowd of protesters were an indication of just how hard it is to be both a politician and a prosecutor. The protesters had been there all day, chanting and giving speeches from the bed of Dwayne "Shorty" Davis's truck, which was outfitted with a grill. He was cooking and giving away food to people so they'd stick around and hear the story of what happened to Keith Davis Jr. Kenji Scott, a former employee of Mosby, yelled out the name of her opponent, also printed on his shirt and the sign he held above his head. "Ivan Bates! Ivan Bates! Ivan Bates!" he cried out. His cadence brought to mind the way the rapper Old Dirty Bastard says, "Psycho Killer Norman Bates" on the song Shimmy Shimmy Ya.
Thank you so much for including Wu-Tang. I'm always appreciative when Wu-Tang is included in something.
Makes it into journalism. Yeah, serious
definitely.
Journalism. So Mosby then gets in her car and they sort of chase her away. And the story then goes back and goes through the whole saga of why Kelly Davis is so upset with Mosby and why Kenji Scott is so upset with Mosby and how it is such a weird position to be in. So should we hear Mosby herself now?
Yeah, let's go.
The Office of the State's Attorney, which is in charge of prosecuting cases, is one of the most important positions in the criminal justice system and one of the few places where the public is able to have direct input into that system. I'm sitting down with each of the candidates to talk to them about the role the state's attorney can play in reforming our system. This is the third and final part of an interview with incumbent Marilyn Mosby. In the first interview, we talked about the trajectory of her first term from Freddie Gray to the Gun Trace Task Force. In the second, we discussed her plans for a second term. And now, we delve into some of the politics surrounding the race and some of the difficult cases she's brought to court. And we certainly live in a society with, as we're seeing with Me Too and all of these things, do you think that some of these criticisms that have come against you are sexist or racist or ageist? Or
I absolutely do. I can tell you that, you know, being 34 years old, winning this position, beating out a powerful white male incumbent, you know, my age, my race, my sex does definitely come into place. And when you look at the role of a prosecutor, it's one of the most important roles within the criminal justice system. They decide who's going to be charged, what they're going to be charged with, what sentence recommendations they're going to make. You cannot ignore, and this is something that I had to learn how to do, not to internalize it, right? The backlash, the misogynistic, sexist sort of views. You cannot ignore that 95% of the prosecutors in this country are white, 79% are white men, and I'm, as a woman of color, I represent 1% of all elected prosecutors in the country. So do I think that, you know, some of the rhetoric, for lack of a better term, against me has to do with that? I do. There's been several occasions where, you know, I've been chastised within the media. There's been occasions where I've been told, play nice, Miss Mosby. It's Mrs. Mosby, by the way. You know, and it is what it is. I've learned how to deal with it.
Some of I mean, the police critics came out early on, but more recently, you've had some critics within the activist community, people who supported you in your run at first Tawanda Jones and then Baltimore Block and Kelly Davis around the Keith Davis case. You know, and so some of the most vocal critics now seem to be other black women who are critical of specific things, of not opening her brother's case or of prosecuting. What would you say to them?
So what I would say is that, you know, I have a great rapport with Tawanda Jones and the Tyrone West family. I have a great respect for their family. You know, the fact that they've been able to bring a voice to police brutality even before there was a national voice is something that, you know, I credit this woman with. And what we've sat down with the family and what we've essentially said is, hey, you know, the most important stages of an investigation are in those beginning stages. Unfortunately, your brother's death took place 3 years before I got into office. And the investigation was conducted by a prior administration. So the things that I would need to contradict or to challenge my predecessor's assessment of that case, I don't necessarily have. And so if you have any sort of additional information that would contradict, you know, his assessment, we are open to looking at that. However, that has not been presented. And so, you know, I don't think that Tawanda Jones is critical of me as state's attorney. I think she is just vocal and about the grief that she feels knowing that her brother was, you know, killed by police officers.
And they did get that new autopsy that showed that it wasn't a heart failure, but it was asphyxiation. Does that change anything?
So again, I can't get into the specifics because it's still under review, but that in and of itself contradicts what a paid, you know, medical examiner versus one medical examiner versus another medical examiner. Does that rise to the level of criminal culpability? And how does that rise to a level of criminal culpability when you have two conflicting experts who say something? Again, we cannot ignore that this investigation took place prior to my administration, and those assessments, those witnesses, you know, all of that, the most important stages of the investigation, I was not a part of.
Right. And I mean, the other case where people from the left as opposed to the right are sort of critical is the Keith Davis case, and his defense that they shot him and then planted the gun on him seemed far-fetched back 2 years ago when the case first started being tried. But after the GTTF revelations that they were coaching people to plant a gun on someone if you shot the wrong person, has that changed? Or it's going ahead again, I guess, right before the election. Does that change your
So what I
thinking?
can say about Keith Davis, and I'm not going to get too far into the murder trial because, again, it's still pending, but the case that is already closed is that it was a matter of he was tried in front of his peers, a jury of his peers. And a jury of his peers determined that he was a felon in possession of a handgun. That gun was tied to what is now a pending murder case. So I understand, you know, Kelly is his fiance and she's not happy with me, but my job as state's attorney is to ensure justice for Kevin Jones, right? It's not about Keith Davis for me. It's about Kevin Jones. That was the victim of the homicide.
Has your ability to trust the police officers bringing cases changed?
The acts of those criminals that were dishonorably wearing those badges aren't indicative of the entire police department. And we do have a codependence on the police department, which is how we're able to get a 93% felony conviction rate. However, I think it's very clear that, I've recruited mission-oriented prosecutors that get it. I want you to cross your T's, I want you to dot your I's, but your mission is justice over convictions. As prosecutors, we don't guarantee convictions, we guarantee the process. That's what took place in Freddie Gray, right?
So Anna Montagna was recently let go, and there was a statement when it was announced that she was no longer working with you, also that you had been contacted by the U.S. Attorney's Office involving the leak from the office on the gun trace task force. Is that what that was about, or can you say have you dealt with the leak in the office?
The press inquiry was actually whether a specific person was employed within my office, and that was a response to it. My office indicated that that person was no longer in my office. There was a second question as to the GTTF investigation, and what I informed the press was that we were, the U.S. Attorney's Office shared components of their investigation. They conducted this investigation, right? They've shared components with their investigation. I am unfortunately not at liberty to discuss those components, and that any questions with regard to any allegations or assertions that were made should be referred to them.
I mean, but as the boss of the office, do you feel, knowing that someone there was telling them, has it made you run a more closed ship, or has it changed the way that you run the office at all, just knowing that that may have happened?
Again, and you said for sure it happened, I would refer you to them.
That was Marilyn Mosby. You can watch all three of our parts of all of the interviews with all of the state's attorneys candidates, Ivan Bates, also Thiru Vignarajah. They're all up on the site. And we hope to be doing some mixing of that stuff so we can hear what they all say on Freddie Gray, and they all say on Gun Trace Task Force, and they all say on murder. What do we got coming up next, Easy?
Next is this piece, Can a government program end racist government practices?
Man, I'm sort of responsible for some of the headlines around here. I'm not happy with that one. I should have thought a little better repeating the word government twice. But, you know, it actually, maybe I'm wrong, because it actually, that's to the point. Can the government stop its own bad stuff?
Yeah, I think it gives two sides of a coin, right? Because government structure has a lot of racist intent in it already from its inception. You know, a lot of laws have been made. You know, you talk about redlining and redistricting, all these types of things. You talk about the criminal justice system and mass incarceration. These are all government implemented things, you know. So if a government is serious about ending racism, especially in America, you know, we first got to tear off all of the, you know, the racist intent that was put into forming these things in the first place. So I think it's an important piece to watch.
Yeah. And so Brandon Scott introduces one proposal for studying racial equity. in government programs, and then it also addresses the proposal for a land trust. And one of the things we want to dig into is how do you address the money if these are competing but going towards the same thing? What wins? So check it out. This is again Taya Graham and Stephen Janis.
Yeah, and they're interviewing Councilman Brandon Scott, who's also running right now for Lieutenant Governor for the state of Maryland.
This is Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. Baltimore is a city defined by inequality, but now a series of proposals are under consideration to address this. The question is, will they succeed? At City Hall, recognition that the process of government itself has produced entrenched divisions between rich and poor and black and white.
We have another story here that we don't like to talk about, and that Baltimore is a hyper-segregated and a city that has a lot of inequality.
Is why people are searching for ways to address them.
The first bill would actually create an equity assessment program for the city of Baltimore, ensuring that every city agency assesses their programs, their policies, their procurement, their hiring practices. The city's capital projects will have to go through an equity assessment program to ensure that from now here on going forward, the city is looking at everything that it does through a lens of equity.
Councilman Brandon Scott says inequity is a byproduct of governance spread throughout a variety of city agencies, which is why he has a bill that would not only assess the problem, but create a charter amendment that would fund solutions pegged at 3% of the police budget, which translates into roughly $15 million.
But it's also going to take investment in dollars into dealing with the inequities across the city, be that racial inequity, be that gender inequity, be that income inequity. And we have to do that through tax dollars, and we think that's why it's important for us to have, in addition, the equity fund for Baltimore City, so that programs, organizations, and the city itself can spend dollars to deal with those issues directly.
The Real News has reported on some of these entrenched inequities in the past. We investigated on how an inclusionary housing law has languished without funding.
Out of 10 units being built in this city, 6 of them should be affordable housing units based upon our tax base and based upon the general population. We're not drawing anybody in. We're keeping those in who can't afford to leave.
And how tax breaks continue to bolster development of luxury apartments around the Inner Harbor, while less affluent communities go without.
I do think that this is a major step forward, that this is a real infusion of significant funds into doing permanently affordable housing.
But a coalition of community organizations says the lack of affordable housing is exactly what their plan will address.
So the question becomes, will we collectively create a concrete program for action? One that is serious, one that rises to the challenges we face. Today marks the beginning of a new path that we have paved. A new path our city can walk down with us. A new test for us, for Baltimore. A test of true democracy. A test that will answer how we will do development without displacement in our neighborhoods.
Which is why they gathered at City Hall to push for a law that would create a permanent funding stream for a $20 million affordable housing fund.
For 20 years, I was able to call Remington my home until my landlord sold the property out from under me. It was brought to my attention that Remington had become in the now. And so housing prices were up and I was out.
The group hopes to use a tax levied on real estate transactions to make the $20 million available annually to build affordable housing and refurbish vacants.
And I know, talking to a number of community members that are interested in accessing this funding, that's what they want to do. They want to take their neighborhoods back and get rid of these vacants, put people back to work, and make sure that the development benefits the people that are living in these neighborhoods.
Efforts that have wide support on the council.
Neighborhood development is the key to increasing Baltimore's population, decreasing vacant homes, and improving our local economy. I'm happy to partner with Chairman Bullock and the rest of my council colleagues to boost an agenda for affordable housing.
But still lacks full endorsement from the mayor.
So we have had some initial conversations with the mayor. We look forward to having more discussions around this. We know that she has ponied up for some money for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. But we definitely know we need some more, so we're looking forward to having more conversations about it. She has not signed on to this proposal, I know, but I do know her team has been in discussion with us.
It's another measure that would change the process of governance that produced the city's stark divide between rich and poor. The question is, will it succeed? This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland.
So now we're going to talk a little. We talked about Wu-Tang a minute ago, and we're going to go back even more old school and talk a little bit about Eric B. and Rakim.
Yeah.
So what's going on? What happened this week?
So Wednesday, Eric B. and Rakim came to Baltimore. They performed at Baltimore Soundstage. And the Baltimore City Mayor, Catherine Pugh, and the new police commissioner, Daryl D'Souza, took the stage and addressed the crowd, where Commissioner D'Souza apologized for 200 years of policing. He went through civil rights all the way up through the 80s and 90s and even early 2000s, apologizing for the zero-tolerance drug policing, and promised to the crowd that, you know, they would bring about some change and fix these things. The crowd was not happy about a police officer standing on stage.
I want to take about 20 seconds. I want to take about 20 seconds to apologize for all the things that the police have done dating back 200 years. We don't care what you say. 200 years ago, all the way to civil rights, all the way to the 80s, when crack was prevalent in the cities and infected disproportionately African American men, all the way to the 90s, all the way to the 2000s where we had zero tolerance. I want to take the time to apologize for what policing did, and I promise you we're going to make a change in the future.
Let me ask you a couple things first, because you know, you're a rapper as well, and as being a journalist, and so you asked as we were sitting there watching it, you're like, am I being a sucker for thinking this is kind of cool? And I mean, I feel the same way. Like, I feel like it's all right, you know, it's kind of a good move and it's a good gesture, and they deserve to say fuck off too if they want to,
right?
And boo, like that's also a legit move for people to do. But I wonder, like, you know, yeah, it's a hard thing, but he could open up his own IED files, you know.
Yeah, that's true too.
Apologize for his own 30 years.
I think as a performer watching it, and as a rapper who has opened for a lot of very famous acts, you know, it's already nerve-wracking, and it's a very scary place to step out on that stage, because most people are just there to see Eric B. and Rakim. You know what I mean? They don't really want to sit through a local act, let alone the fucking police standing there talking to them. So
there's another story you were talking about related to this, about you know, the police are working, that you're going to be working on next week. The police are working with local musicians to actually make music?
Yeah, Chariz Marcel, Ogun Gordy, the Dream Bigger Camp.
And Ogun is from Ceasefire, also one of the Ceasefire
Ceasefire's got some hand in it. They're recording music with young people and police officers. So I'm, you know, going to be talking to them next week and try to see what that's like. I saw Chariz in the supermarket, and he was just like, "Man, getting police officers to rap is
BPD or BDP."
BDP. Right.
BPMD.
Right.
In the house.
Get a BPMD album going on. The crossover.
So another story. This is changing the tone a little bit, and we're going a little more. Well, to Hopkins and then internationally, with them trying to stop the CIA from recruiting on Hopkins campus. And this is a student activist group that Taya and Stephen have been following for a little while. So it's an interesting story about how they're trying to take control over what their university is doing. And, you know, good on them for trying to voice their concerns to their university. And you know, yeah, it's sort of crazy that the CIA is recruiting at Hopkins. And I mean, but you could also criticize from the other angle, like, is the CIA recruiting at Morgan?
Right.
Is the CIA recruiting at Coppin?
Right. Yeah.
And like, not that they should be recruiting anywhere, but
yeah, like, what's the intention, you know, behind this, and what's the bigger picture? I think it's interesting. One of the things I've noticed with a lot with Micah, especially post Freddie Gray, you have a lot of kids or students not from Baltimore, a lot of them white and Asian, really like moving into the city, becoming a part of the city, and seeing a narrative that you know, that doesn't really exist. You know what I mean? And an unnecessary police force, you know, unnecessary enforcement, and they're taking action. And now, you know, seeing Hopkins students do this, for me, is particularly surprising because Johns Hopkins students historically have kind of like, you know, been in a bubble, you know what I mean, and kind of not really realistic about, I think, the world they live in, you know, when coming to Baltimore. So I think this is a very, another really, really interesting piece to look at.
All right, let's check it out.
We first encountered the Johns Hopkins students who constitute the group Youth Against War and Racism at the International Women's March last month. There they expressed solidarity with the community in a fight for equal pay and social equity.
Today is International Working Women's Day. It's a really important day. It's a day for expressing solidarity with women and non-binary people all over the world, women and non-binary people in struggle.
Since then, the coalition of students and community members have been instrumental in stopping a proposed police department for the university.
The constituencies of the properties around Hopkins, either students or the communities, didn't like it the way it was. They didn't know what was going on, and they're the ones that vote for us.
A bill that would have authorized Hopkins to hire cops with arrest power to patrol campus was withdrawn by its sponsor, Kurt Anderson, due to the pushback.
And one of the things that they'll have to do when they come back is to put in there enough assurances to the community that the community itself will have some oversight over this police force if, in fact, Hopkins continues with this effort.
Ho, ho! The CIA has got to go! Hey, hey! Ho, ho! The CIA has...
And recently the students staged a protest at the Hopkins Career Center over a visit by the CIA.
It's definitely important for students at Hopkins to care about it because we are being recruited more heavily, but this really is a human issue and a community issue as well.
The CIA is just another arm of the school to war pipeline, which, you know, takes brilliant Hopkins students and puts them to work making weapons and overthrowing governments in other countries and working with these imperialist agencies, and then these technologies that they're creating are going to come home and oppress people here in Baltimore.
CIA, how many people did you kill today? Hey, hey, hey! CIA, how many people did you kill today?
Security guards hovered nearby, but did not make arrests. But the students said they had to take a stand against an institution that is too often involved in military research and weapon design.
And so the real issue here is that we've got, you know, the military, we've got the NSA, we've got the FBI, we've got the CIA infiltrating schools, infiltrating universities, infiltrating high schools, and recruiting students to be part of this war machine.
If we don't get it, shut it down! If we don't get it, shut it down!
Another step for them to build consciousness on campus, that the voices of youth must be heard to change not just minds, but the institution they attend. This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland.
One more piece, and this is going to be another old piece from 2015. The headline is actually "Hundreds Protest in Baltimore, No Police Charged Yet" in Freddie Gray's death. And so we know that there were 6 officers charged. None were convicted, but they were charged. So one of the things I accidentally said in that Mosby piece I was reading from, that they lost all the cases. And so Mosby's office was really angry with me about that. Maybe not angry is not the right word. They took right umbrage with that because they didn't lose all the cases. They didn't try several of them.
Right.
And they had one mistrial as well. So they failed to win any of the cases rather than they lost any of the cases. So,
yeah. And again, just going back to like revisiting this, I think this piece takes us back to a moment of a lot of frustration, you know, a lot of anger, a lot of heartbreak that was going on in the city at the time, and a real call from the public to charge someone, and what was taking so long, you know, and just kind of the climate, the real climate of Baltimore at that time, I think is important to look at.
And what you see here is that this is the day. This is April the 25th.
Yeah,
and it's the day that battles sort of broke out down at Camden Yards, and I was down there, and it broke out when drunk Red Sox fans started throwing things and yelling racial slurs, and then things went kind of nuts. Some windows got broken as people were trying to get into the Orioles park, and then you know, and this was when the big march started up at the Western District at about 3 that day and worked its way down there. And then late that night, back up at the Western District, the cops really took revenge and kind of came and one guy that I was up there with photographer Joe Giordano, and they really wanted to get this guy. So they arrested the other photographer, and then they knocked down Giordano and stomped him, and we're dragging him away, and he's still got the shot of them hitting this dude in the head with the club. And so it was one of the more brutal nights of the uprising that follows right after this. And so we'll watch this piece from back in 2015.
In Baltimore on Saturday, April 15th, about 1,500 people took part in the largest demonstrations to date against the killing of 25-year-old West Baltimore resident Freddie Gray in police custody. The arrest was captured on video. Police say Gray was fine when he was placed in a van and transported, but his spine was severed 80% from his neck, and he died after being in a coma for a week. 12 were arrested as frustration and anger over the lack of answers or accountability over Gray's death erupted into what police characterized as isolated incidents of violence.
Lock them up, hold them, same way they do us, we commit a murder or a crime, hold them, and then investigate. You don't let them go on no paid vacation.
Top police and union officials traded jabs over the weekend after Commissioner Anthony Batts acknowledged the police made errors when they arrested Gray, including not buckling in his seatbelt or getting him immediate medical attention. Those comments were criticized by the Fraternal Order of Police for being politically driven and for jumping to conclusions before the completion of the internal investigation on May 1st. The march began at 3 p.m. at Gilmore Homes, where Freddie Gray lived and died, then headed into the heart of downtown Baltimore with the goal of shutting the city down. The march targeted the major thoroughfare of Pratt Street along with Oriole Park and Camden Yards. By 5 p.m., the demonstrators rallied at City Hall. About an hour later, they headed back towards Oriole Park to try to shut down the Orioles versus Red Sox game with a 7:05 start time.
And until we disrupt, and I'm not about violence, I'm talking about until we disrupt like this, until we prevent them from going to the game and from the stadium making the money because people can't get there, they're not going to listen to us.
The march was largely peaceful, but several incidents of violence were documented by media and bystanders. But Gray is just one in a number of controversial police custody deaths in Baltimore. Anthony Anderson died after he was thrown to the ground by police in 2013. Last summer, surveillance cameras captured Officer Vincent Cosom brutalizing Colin Truss, and Tyrone West was beaten to death in North Baltimore after a routine car stop. Since then, his family, including his sister Tawanda Jones, have been leading voices for police reform, most of which was defeated in Annapolis earlier this year.
Working on the officers' Bill of Rights as well as many laws, putting body cams on officers and everything. And all of our laws that we were fighting for got killed. They killed every bill.
All these incidents speak to the need for fundamental change in the way the city is policed. Protesters also pointed to politics. They say city officials have often ignored instances of police brutality in the past. The use of police violence against the city's black population is systemic. As we've said on The Real News, police are enforcing laws, often with deadly force, to make people obey legislation that at its heart protects people that own property and perpetuates chronic poverty. The more you own, the more you are served and protected.
Man, it's weird to think back. In some ways it feels like it's almost, you know, PTSD like inducing to look back at some of that, and in some ways it feels so long ago, and in some ways it feels like it wasn't long ago at all. And
when I think about this time, looking back, it just was interesting the amount of conversations I was having with people who weren't from Baltimore. You know, like I said before, I was just coming home from my first U.S. tour. And so, you know, I was getting messages and calls from people all around the country. you know what I mean, and having these conversations about Baltimore, you know, and asking me my perspective of having grown up here and living here, and you know what the relationship between police were and community, and all of a sudden there's this spotlight, you know what I mean, on us that I've never seen, and we've seen effects of it in so many different ways. You know, the tourism industry here has been affected. You know, restaurants, the music industry, the art industry, everything here kind of has had a trickle down, not trickle down, but a direct effect in some way post uprising.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, and it feels to me like we almost had a revolution. We were on the verge of something really happening, and while it's affected everything, like we were saying at the beginning, in some ways, like nothing has changed, and everyone was so interested in it for a while. I mean, on the 27th, I got a phone call from MSNBC. They're like, "Hey, are you willing to talk to us?" And I'm like, "Sure, I guess." And like I'm standing out in the middle of the shit, and they're like, "Okay, we're going to put you through to the host." And the host was Al Sharpton. I'm like, Al Sharpton's interviewing me? This is nuts. Like, and then nobody cares about Baltimore at all again. We do care about Baltimore here at the Baltimore Bureau, at the Real News Network. And
very much so.
Yeah, we love y'all, love the city. One shout out, man. One of the things that got me through the whole uprising was Mike Nice on WEAA with the Hip Hop Chronicles.
Shout out to Mike Nice.
Every night he would have on like the speeches of the day, like Carl Stokes really like going off on CNN or whatever, put to music. And I'd be out all day, so I wouldn't be able to hear what had actually happened. In some ways I knew more, and in some ways I knew less than everyone else. And so I really, like, Mike saved me every night coming in, so shout out to him. And also to Dwayne Gladden and to Stephen Frank and David Hebden for helping us put this together today. Again, congratulations to Eddie Conway. And as it happens to be 420 today, and I was playing you this song since we're back in 2015 that I made asking the mayor and members of the city council if they wanted to smoke some weed with me. And so I was not employed here at that time, by the way. I was employed by City Paper, but let's roll out with that. We'll go out and listen to Come On Mayor, SRB. And oh man, it's kind of crazy that Pew makes me miss SRB a little bit. So come on Mayor, SRB, won't you smoke a little weed with me for a 420 throwback?
Happy 420.
Love y'all.